FBI and CIA agents leak their secrets. Story 1. I'm not in the CIA or FBI, but I've held a clearance, so I can offer a little insight. Two things. First, a lot of secret operations happen right in front of people's faces, under the guise of normal, everyday activity. Second, real classified programs and operations never have names that actually describe what they're about. Instead, they use two completely random words that wouldn't normally come up in conversation, something like cracked gorilla, which I just made up. So when someone talks about a classified program with a super relevant name, it's either very old or just a nickname. The only programs with names that make sense are public ones with PR motives, like Desert Storm. Story 2. People assume James Bond's job is about gathering intelligence. It's really not. In every Bond movie, within the first 15 minutes, he meets a local intelligence officer who already knows what's going on and hands him a stack of information. Bond's job is handling situations, stealing physical files, blowing things up, escorting people to safety, and occasionally eliminating problems. Story 3. This is an old family story, but we still laugh about it today. I had a great uncle who worked in construction, specializing in high-end plaster and rendering. Over the years, he did some jobs involving security-related projects in Australia. In his later years, he became obsessed with the idea that agencies like the CIA, FBI, and Australian intelligence had technology decades ahead of its time. He would go on and on about things that sounded absurd back then: in-ear communication devices, video-enabled wristwatches, handheld computers with slim, high-resolution screens, and instant global data transfers. At the time, it all seemed like wild conspiracy talk. This was before smartphones and tablets were common. But looking back now, everything he described turned out to be pretty accurate. Maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. Story 4. I work for the federal government, and a lot of former intelligence officers use my agency as a transition job before fully retiring. Since we deal with very little sensitive material, it's a low-pressure stop before they move on. I once met someone who told me their entire job with the CIA was to own and manage a small advertising company specializing in billboards, all while living as an average civilian. They would constantly ask about the purpose of their role, but the only response they ever got was, "If you get an order for an ad to be posted on that billboard, post it. That's all you have to do." What creeped them out the most? They never once received an ad request that seemed strange or suspicious. Story 5. My dad was a chief petty officer in Navy Airborne. He was the chief on the largest plane they had at the time, one with 3 tails. Growing up, I was always told his job was to fly dignitaries to meetings in different countries as part of a goodwill mission. That plane later crashed in Antarctica and was replaced by a state-of-the-art jet with a sonar disc attached to the roof. My dad even got permission from Warner Brothers to paint Wile E. Coyote on one side and Roadrunner on the other. About 10 years ago, the Navy declassified a batch of documents, and I was browsing through them just for fun. That's when I stumbled upon my dad's plane in a NOAA report. Curious, I contacted the person who had declassified the papers. When I told him my dad's name, he responded with something that shocked me. He said my dad was famous. He compared him to the women at NASA who solved complex equations before computers. I always knew my dad was intelligent. He had skipped 3 grades in school, but I had no idea he was that important. Turns out he worked on Project Magnet, which replotted global longitudes and latitudes to correct maps worldwide. His calculations were so precise that they're still used by NOAA today. And this was all before calculators even existed. He passed away in the mid-70s from a heart condition. For most of my life, I had no idea what he had accomplished, until an email with an official letterhead told me the truth. Story 6. A few years ago, a relative who was part of Trump's cabinet gave my family and me a private tour of the White House. We even got to see the Oval Office. She showed us his Coca-Cola button. Pretty cool. Later that day, we were hanging out in a private lounge at our hotel. My dad was on the phone when a sharp but casually dressed man walked in and started making coffee. He was friendly, asking us how we enjoyed our White House tour. My siblings and I gave polite answers, assuming he was someone our dad had spoken to earlier. As he finished his coffee and walked out, he casually asked if we were from California. We said yes and asked how he knew. He just smiled and said, "I can tell," then left. When our dad got off the phone, we asked who that guy was. He had no idea. Weird. Story 7. My dad had an old friend who was a former CIA agent. I think he was in the military overseas before that. For a while, he lived with us. Apparently, he was going through a rough time and needed support. At one point, we all took a road trip to visit my grandparents. During dinner one night, he got completely blackout drunk. My grandpa, being a bit of a drinker himself, didn't think much of it. As a socially clueless 14-year-old, I didn't either. But on the drive back, out of nowhere, this man broke down, full-on sobbing. He started confessing, apologizing to Jesus and everyone in the car for all the men he had killed while working for the CIA. He even went into details, horrific stuff, now that I think about it, but at the time, I thought it was the funniest thing in the world. I couldn't stop laughing in the back seat. The next morning, he didn't remember a thing. I have no idea if anyone ever told him. Story 8. My sister was an intelligence officer assigned to a Special Forces FOB in Afghanistan. Before deployment, she had to pass a firearms qualification course. She failed. As a result, she wasn't allowed to carry a weapon while deployed. The instructor told her she was one of a very select few who were so bad at shooting that they couldn't pass. Then, as a joke, he handed her a knife instead. She spent the deployment doing whatever intelligence officers do, and hanging around the gym, watching Special Forces guys lift. Story 9. Operation Ivy Bells was a plan to tap Soviet underwater communication lines. The official cover story? A team of divers recovering fragments of a new Soviet supersonic anti-ship missile. The wiretap itself was a failure thanks to a spy, but the dive teams did recover all the missile fragments from the Soviet tests. By reverse engineering them, the US learned that the missiles were only radar guided. The assumed infrared guidance system never existed. That was critical intelligence. Story 10. Your iPhone can recognize you with a mask, glasses, or a hat. It just chooses not to. The tech is incredibly accurate, widely available, and not expensive. It's just being difficult on purpose. Story 11. Facial recognition software works by analyzing key structures of your face. The more of your face it can see, the more confident it is in making a match. While just your eyes and nose bridge can be enough to identify you, the margin of error is too high for it to be the only security measure on a sensitive device like your phone. The next iOS update is actually adding an option that allows Face ID to unlock using only the upper portion of your face, as long as you're wearing a paired Apple Watch. It basically turns the unlock process into a seamless two-factor authentication system. Story 12. My parents' neighbor is an FBI agent. He thinks he's above the law, constantly parks in front of a stop sign at the end of our street. Despite multiple complaints, the local cops won't ticket him. I played beer pong with him at a block party once. Turns out he's a forensic accountant. He hated it when I called him nothing more than an accountant with a badge. Story 13. As someone who has worked in law enforcement both as a city officer and a federal agent, I can tell you that the FBI and CIA are not quite what you think. The FBI in particular has a habit of taking credit for work they weren't involved in. They focus more on maintaining a high-profile image than actual investigative work. And their reports? Absolutely terrible. The CIA does engage in some interesting operations, but they also prioritize appearances. If you're looking for the real heavy hitters in U.S. federal law enforcement, look at the DEA and Homeland Security. The ATF also has an interesting role, but their leadership has been known to make highly questionable decisions. Story 14. When my grandfather passed away, we found a box of official identification documents, passports, licenses, you name it, all with his picture, but different names and nationalities. We'll never know the full story. What we do know is that he was a highly skilled man who could craft knives and spoke 6 languages fluently. Story 15. Any device with a microphone that connects to the internet is always listening. While it's unlikely a human will ever personally hear what you say, everything is being recorded, categorized, and used for data collection. That information is then sold to other companies. You won't get in trouble for it, though, because you already gave permission. You clicked accept on the terms of use without reading them. Story 16. I have a friend with a PhD in a highly specialized field from a top university that made them very appealing to a well-known defense contractor, one that specializes in creating, let's say, explosive solutions. When my friend was being vetted for the job, all of us in their social circle were interviewed. My friend had warned us in advance, saying, just be honest. After they were hired, we would occasionally meet for drinks or dinner, and I would always beg for a hint about what kind of work they were doing. I even tried to frame it vaguely. Just tell me, was it offense or defense? The closest I ever got to an answer was, in my work, offense and defense are the same thing. Now stop asking. You know I can't talk about it. That was as much as I was ever going to get. Story 17. Not sure if this falls under the FBI, CIA, or another agency, but here's the story. A friend of mine worked in wetsuit repairs for years. One day, their boss announced they had received a repair order from the government. Because it was a government job, the instructions were unusually strict. They were only allowed to fix specific holes and nothing else. When the suits arrived, they were full of holes, but there was a pattern. The holes ran along the arms, body, and legs in a structured way. The only holes they were asked to repair were the ones that didn't match that pattern. Confused, they called the contact who had brought in the suits to ask why they weren't fixing all the damage. The man got irritated and told them if they asked any more questions, he would take the suits elsewhere. So, they followed the instructions, fixed only the specified areas, and got paid. That was the last order they ever received from that client. Later on, their boss let slip what the suits were actually for: deep-sea diving. The holes were intentional, designed to allow hoses to pump warm water inside the suit to regulate body temperature in extreme depths. Story 18. Former badge carrier from a well-known intelligence agency here. Here's a tip. A lot of federal buildings have coffee shops inside. When you're a newly trained, straight-laced recruit fresh out of the academy, and you're sent to grab coffee for your team, patience is key. One day I walked into the coffee shop inside our building. The clerk ignored me for a few minutes, then took his time straightening newspapers. Finally, he strolled over to the counter and casually burped, right in my face. I was this close to snapping, but I didn't. Good thing, too. Turns out there's a federal program that trains visually impaired individuals to operate these shops. My building was one of the participating sites. Looking back, I thank God my younger, more impatient self didn't lose his temper that day. Story 19. My aunt worked for the FBI in Chicago for years. She always found it hilarious how high-tech the FBI looks in movies. Apparently, when they were filming Public Enemies, a movie set in the 1930s, they borrowed some of her office's filing cabinets for the set. That should tell you everything about the cutting-edge look of her workplace. A far cry from the all-glass interiors and high-tech gadgets Hollywood loves so much. Story 20. I once dated a guy who worked at a high level in the government. Getting close to someone in that world is extremely difficult. He couldn't talk about anything. The most I ever got was that he occasionally busted drug lords, but even that was vague. I could tell, though, he had seen some dark things. There was always this haunted look about him. Most of us go home, vent to our partners, talk about our day. For people in those agencies, there's none of that. It's a completely isolating experience. Their only real emotional outlet is each other. That world is a brotherhood for a reason. Story 21. I interned at the CIA during my senior year. One thing to know, most people claiming to have insider knowledge are probably lying. When you work for the CIA, anything you say about your job has to go through an official review process. They can approve or deny anything you want to share. That agreement lasts for life. One thing I can talk about, the CIA doesn't blackmail people for information. They might pay sources or provide incentives, but their inside people aren't forced into it. That's not the case with many foreign intelligence agencies. Story 22. I knew a girl in college who got recruited into the FBI. I had no idea she had applied, so imagine my reaction when I started getting multiple calls from a Washington, D.C. number. Every time the guy on the other end said he was with the feds. Spooked me out at first. Turns out he was just doing a background check. Apparently, she had listed me as one of her contacts. Would have been nice if she gave me a heads up first. Story 23. Back before the Berlin Wall came down, Soviet radio operators each carried personal activation keys for their military radio sets. These keys had slight electrical differences, which subtly altered the signal. Western intelligence couldn't decrypt the messages, but they could track who was transmitting just by analyzing these signal properties. Typically, only a few Soviet operators were active at any given time, but if tensions rose or military exercises were planned, more operators would go live, giving NATO valuable intel. Then one day every Soviet operator started transmitting in relay. The airwaves were full of activity. NATO had received no prior intelligence about any planned operations, so panic set in. Was this a prelude to an attack? Had something gone wrong? Military counter-scenarios were quickly put into motion, just in case. But then, one NATO radio operator noticed something strange. While the operator keys were varied, all the transmissions were coming from the same radio equipment at a single location near the east-west border. Suspicious, he sent his findings up the chain of command and recommended a spy plane fly over the area to investigate. A plane was scrambled immediately. The photos it returned infuriated NATO generals. The Soviets were using all their operators at once, but not for a military operation. The operators were lined up outside a radio building, walking in one by one, broadcasting a brief transmission, then exiting and looping back to the end of the line. But it wasn't just the relay that annoyed NATO brass, it was the shape of the line. The Soviets had discovered they were being tracked, knew exactly how NATO would react, and decided to have a little fun with it. The operators had formed a massive snaking queue around the radio station, shaped like the hammer and sickle. I don't know what the Russian phrase for screw you is, but that was definitely the message they sent that day. Story 24. I wasn't in the CIA or FBI, but I did work as a defense contractor with a security clearance. Honestly, none of the classified information I dealt with would be of any interest to the average person. The only people who'd care would be extreme tech nerds who specialize in phased arrays or foreign adversaries trying to figure out how to counter our technology. I used to have a friend who was very anti-government. He constantly argued that I had a duty to leak what I knew for the sake of the people. He thought I was sitting on deep secrets that could expose government tyranny. Ironically, he ended up getting a security clearance himself. After just 1 month on the job, he admitted, "Yeah, none of this stuff is actually important to anybody. Like, sure, information wants to be free and all that, but what's the average American going to do with the optimal spacing pattern for a phased array antenna at a specific frequency? Build their own billion-dollar radar system in their backyard?" Story 25. A close friend of mine had been dating this guy for a few weeks, but she was getting frustrated with how often he was unavailable. Sometimes he'd respond to texts immediately, other times he'd go completely silent for days. He finally told her that he was a special agent and that he could get in serious trouble for even saying this, but he had been on a secret mission in South America. She was skeptical, but wanted to believe him. I told her, he's either lying or he's a really bad secret agent for spilling classified intel to someone he just met. She gave me her phone, and I texted him, "Say hi to your wife for me." She never heard from him again. Story 26. The CIA case officer, operations officer job is one of the most paperwork-heavy jobs I've ever seen. Also, I've never understood why the CIA gets pulled into so many US conspiracy theories. The agency has almost zero interest in domestic politics unless a foreign entity is involved. Story 27. When I applied for a clerical position at the FBI, something strange happened. One day on the subway, a random woman sat next to me and asked if I'd be willing to write a letter encouraging her son to apply to a school for the deaf. I'm deaf myself, how could she have even known that? I agreed, wrote the letter, met her for dinner once, and that was the end of it. I've always wondered, was this some kind of FBI background check? For the record, I didn't get the job. An old college debt disqualified me. Story 28. My grandfather was CIA. We all knew, but we also knew better than to ask questions. As time passed and some of his missions were declassified, he'd occasionally share bits and pieces. One night at dinner, he turned to my mom and said, "Remember that time you dropped me off at Dulles Airport?" She replied, "Which time?" Turns out he never actually flew out of Dulles. He was immediately taken to Camp Perry and then helicoptered overseas. He spent 30 years as a demolitions expert, defusing bombs all over the world. His claim to fame? Tokyo Rose used to personally call him every time he landed in Japan. The man never traveled under his real name. Story 29. When I was 16, I became really close, really fast friends with a guy in my school choir. His dad worked for Lockheed Martin and traveled constantly, 3 or 4 times a month, always to Chicago. After knowing each other casually for 2 years, we suddenly became inseparable, hanging out until 10 p.m. almost every night, getting lunch together every day, even adjusting our class schedules to be in the same sections. Apparently, this sudden friendship raised a few eyebrows. One day, my friend came to school and told me that his dad had started asking a lot of questions about me. Who my parents were, what my house was like, whether he had met my siblings, if I was an obedient student, or if I was snarky. He was convinced his dad was being asked to pass along intel to his boss. So, the government briefly entertained the possibility that a high school junior was a threat to missile systems or satellite security. Story 30. Years ago, I had a customer who worked for the FBI in a tech support role, not an agent, just IT. He signed up to coach his 5-year-old's Pee-wee soccer team. At the first game, he met his assistant coach, seemed like a normal guy. That Monday, he was called into his supervisor's office, where he was met by a group of agents. Turns out, his assistant coach was a well-known mafia boss, and the FBI, they wanted to know everything they talked about. He was stunned, first because he had no idea, second because they did. Story 31. Back in college, one of my political science textbooks mentioned an incident from Nixon's presidency. Apparently, Nixon demanded to leave the White House to attend a musical, completely unplanned, no security prep, nothing. The Secret Service scrambled to contain the situation, and after a lot of convincing, they eventually got him to stay put. Years later, we had a new neighbor who worked for the Secret Service. One night, his family came over for dinner, and I casually brought up the story from my textbook. He nearly dropped his fork. Mouth hanging open, he just stared at me. Finally, he admitted that the story was 100% true, but was supposed to be classified. I showed him the book, and he quickly jotted down the author's name. No idea what happened after that, but it definitely made dinner more interesting. Story 32. I used to live in a CIA-approved neighborhood near headquarters. Rumor was it was chosen because there was only one way in and out. I had no idea I was surrounded by intelligence officers until I started dating a former convict, of course. Every morning, a group of CIA employees would gather at a Starbucks before getting picked up by a white van and driven to Langley. One day, my neighbor casually mentioned my recent job promotion. When I asked how she knew, she said she read about it in the paper. It wasn't in the paper. Also, a Russian couple who had lived in the neighborhood for 8 years suddenly disappeared. That's all I got. Story 33. I'm not in the FBI, but I recently went through the hiring process and was in frequent contact with an FBI recruiter. Here's what I learned. Becoming an FBI employee takes 1 to 2 years due to extensive background checks, training, and exams. The FBI does all the things you see in movies, just way slower. Special agents are not spies, they're cops. That last part was what made me walk away from the application process. I initially thought the role had a diplomatic or international component, which interested me. Turns out it's mostly domestic law enforcement. Still, an interesting experience. Story 34. I don't work for any elite agency, but I used to work in real estate, and honestly, the amount of free, publicly available information is insane. People worry about the government spying on them, but the reality is, you don't need intelligence agencies to dig up dirt. Most of it is already out there. You can find phone numbers, family members, birthdays, current and past addresses, home values, layouts, even family histories. That's why I have to laugh when people get paranoid about microchips and vaccines. Your phone already tracks you. Your apps know how you hold your phone. They can tell if you're the type to make impulse purchases at 2 a.m. while lying in bed. Facebook and TikTok are ridiculously intrusive and sell your data. They own everything you post. Some people have even seen their photos pop up in ads without ever giving consent. And if you think the government is the biggest threat, think again. Target's algorithm is so precise it can predict pregnancies based on shopping habits and start pushing maternity ads before a woman even tells her family. The FBI and CIA, they're focused on criminals. It's the commercial world, real estate agents, app developers, retail brands that's trying to squeeze every cent out of you. But try explaining that to the people convinced Bill Gates belongs in prison. Story 35. I've known a couple of Navy SEALs and an Army Ranger. None of them looked like The Rock or Terry Crews. The kind of fitness required for their job is more like an Ironman triathlete than a bodybuilder. One of the SEALs told me that extra muscle is actually a disadvantage. It just adds unnecessary weight when you have to walk, run, swim, and carry gear for miles. Plus, it's hard to maintain serious bulk with their deployment schedules. They were also some of the most unassuming, modest people I've ever met. You wouldn't pick them out of a crowd. Story 36. My ex was married to an FBI agent and always talked about how insanely long the interview process was. Apparently, they even went back and interviewed his kindergarten teacher. She also told me that if someone in your life really worked for the CIA, you would never know. They take secrecy seriously. There's no casual, offhanded, yeah, I used to be in the CIA conversations. If someone brags about it, they probably weren't actually CIA. So the idea that anyone here is dropping real agency secrets, pretty unlikely. Story 37. My sister-in-law works in one of those organizations. She doesn't tell us much about what she does, but she does have a large backpack with a radio phone attached. She told us, if it rings, don't answer it. Just drop everything and get out of town. Fast. Story 38. I have a few friends who are CIA officers. First off, CIA employees are officers, not agents. The agents are the people they recruit to spy for them. That brings me to an odd experience. Years ago, I worked at General Motors dealing with a Mexican logistics company. This company was owned by a multi-billion-dollar Mexican family. And in Mexico, wealthy families tend to have cartel connections, so some U.S. federal agencies started getting involved. The FBI and DEA were there, but one guy stood out. No badge, no agency name, asked very specific questions about the company's logistics capabilities. I'm 90% sure I was being used as an unwitting intelligence asset. That aside, anyone who's a U.S. citizen can apply to the CIA. It's not that hard. If you have a degree in computer science, statistics, engineering, or accounting, and can pass a clearance check, you're already in a good position. And despite how exciting it sounds, most of the work is boring. A lot of it is just tracing manufacturing supply chains, whether it's a logistics company in Mexico or figuring out how China sources components for its satellites. Story 39. I met an old retired CIA spook at a wedding reception. He looked exactly like Colonel Sanders. Fascinating guy. I asked, I don't want you to tell me anything you can't, but I'd love to know. When Kennedy was assassinated, what was the talk around the office? Without hesitation, he said, hell, we all thought Johnson did it. Story 40. I'm not in the CIA, but my friend is. She disappeared from social media after college, went off the grid, and got recruited. She told us she was interested and majored in political science. Then poof, gone. I hope she's doing well. Story 41. If you apply for a job at GCHQ, MI5, MI6, or Filingdales, they will interview every close family member. If even a minor red flag comes up, you might not get the job. Also, if you're of Chinese, Russian, or North Korean descent, possibly going as far back as a grandparent or great-grandparent, you won't even be able to apply. My stepdad was MI6. Fun fact, if he wants to visit certain countries like Israel, he has to get permission from the Ministry of Defense first. Story 42. I spoke with some CIA recruiters in college and almost applied after attending a group Q&A and a smaller, more private session. What stuck with me? Most CIA officers are out of shape and have minimal combat training. They don't fight. That's the military's job. If confronted, they're trained to either surrender immediately or drop their bags and run. Story 43. Want to work for them? Prepare for a lot of paperwork. You'll need to provide contact info for every employer you've ever had, contact info for close friends, a full history of every address you've lived at. Then, agents will go out and interview a bunch of those people. Next, you take a psychological exam and get interviewed by a psychologist. Finally, you go through a polygraph and a professional lie detector interview. Story 44. I'm not CIA, but I've worked with and know people in intelligence. Most of the intel we collect comes from OSINT, open source intelligence. That means news articles, press releases, government statements, and public information. People imagine intelligence officers as James Bond or Jason Bourne, but in reality, the majority of analysts spend their days at a desk reading through news articles. That's not to say all intelligence gathering happens this way. Methods like GeoInt, geospatial intelligence, IMINT, imagery intelligence, and SIGINT, signals intelligence, exist too. But even those specialists mostly spend their time zooming in on satellite images or analyzing the same radio signal over and over again. Story 45. My dad's uncle spent his entire life telling people he worked at a button factory. After he passed away, we found out he actually worked in a missile factory, assembling gyroscopes for missile guidance systems. We always knew my grandfather worked at the Pentagon, but we never knew exactly what he did. Every 6 months or so, he'd call my mom with the same conversation. I have another clearance upgrade coming up, so you'll probably get a call like always. Just wanted to give you a heads up. Sure enough, a week later, some government agency, always a different one, would call to ask my mom a list of questions. When he passed away from Alzheimer's, 4 men in black suits showed up at his funeral. No one knew who they were. After the burial, they approached his widow and handed her a plaque featuring 17 different government agency emblems. Turns out his job was interagency cooperation and training, basically making sure different government organizations worked together and shared knowledge. Now, his son works for them too. Doing what exactly? We don't know, and we don't ask. Story 46. I worked with a woman who was former NSA. We constantly begged her to tell us stories. She never did. The one thing she did share? During training, they show new recruits a video compilation of things the agency has uncovered and stopped. She said she barely slept for 2 weeks after watching it. Story 47. There's a book called Moscow Rules, written by 2 former CIA officers. It's all about disguises and spycraft. During the Cold War, the KGB followed every single American in Russia 24/7 looking for spies. So a huge part of the CIA's job was just shaking their tails. They had quick change disguises, diversion tactics, the works. The movie Argo was partially based on one of the author's experiences. Story 48. Brian Michael Bendis, the comic book writer behind Miles Morales and House of M, once gave a talk at the George Bush Center for Intelligence, GBCI, at CIA headquarters in Langley. When he arrived, they told him to wait in a break room. He wasn't allowed to have his laptop, phone, notebook, or even his own pen. Instead, they handed him a CIA-issued notebook, which would be reviewed before he left. While he was sitting there, a young analyst walked in for coffee. He saw Bendis, immediately recognized him, and started to react like a fan. Then he suddenly froze. He started sweating. Finally, he leaned in and whispered, "Is this a test?" Story 49. My high school girlfriend worked for the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO, after college. At the time, they were responsible for analyzing spy satellite images. She told me 2 things. The office had a special garbage chute for disposing of classified materials. As a hazing ritual, new employees were told they had to shout their badge number down the chute before throwing anything in. She wouldn't tell me anything about the resolution quality of spy photos, but she did let it slip that Russian sailors would sunbathe nude on their submarines in the Black Sea, and some of the women in her office would pin those images up in their cubicles like beefcake posters. Story 50. My aunt has been an FBI agent for 25 years. The only thing I know about her job is that she's an office administrator. However, when she was part of the investigation into the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas, her name and address, along with those of other agents, were leaked online. No idea why. She also once took our family on a tour of Las Vegas FBI headquarters. One weird detail that stuck with me: all the doors were floor-to-ceiling 9-foot doors. Still have no idea why.